I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you news from across Ukraine, analyse issues of recruitment as Kyiv aims to persuade Ukrainian men living abroad to return to fight, and we hear why a criminal complaint against the Russian Federation was filed in Argentina.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 30th of April, 2 years and 67 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, Ukrainian journalist, author and co-founder of the Public Interest Journalism Lab, Nataliya Gumenyuk, and senior foreign correspondent Roland Oliphant. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, thanks, David. Hi, everybody. Hi, welcome, Natalia. Great to see you. So 5 people being killed, dozens injured in a Russian strike on a Ukrainian law school known locally as the Harry Potter Castle in the southern city of Odessa. This is coming from local officials this morning. Footage shows the roof of the ornate building, which is a private law academy, all but destroyed after the strike and then there's firefighters battling the flames. Odessa Mayor Hennady Trukhanov said in a video posted on Telegram, he said, "Monsters, beasts, savages, scum. I don't know what else to say. People are going for a walk by the sea and they're shooting and killing." Now, the building is also reported to be the residence of a prominent MP, Serhiy Kivalov, who runs the law academy. He was believed to have been wounded in the strike. This comes from Ukrainian media. The Ukrainian Navy spokesperson Dmitry Pledenchuk said the strike was conducted by an Iskander-M ballistic missile with a cluster warhead. Now, cluster munitions against that target would have been, it's not a target, against that civilian object would be a war crime. We obviously can't verify any of those claims, but footage that you'll see on social media seems to be indicative of a cluster munition strike. There were some quotes from some students of the Law Academy, with one person saying that a missile was hit in the air and it was brought down onto the facility. That may also be true, but that is not what's caused the strike that I've just seen on social media. And you will undoubtedly hear, if they bother at all, Russian authorities will say, "Oh, well, we weren't aiming for that. It was a missile that was brought down by Ukrainian air defence." I think that's rubbish. I think it was a cluster munition from what I've seen, the footage that you'll be able to find. But have a look and make up your own mind. But I think this was another war crime. Now, elsewhere, Ukrainian authorities say Russia has hit 10 Ukrainian regions over the last 24 hours, causing deaths and injuries across the country. Donetsk governor said one person killed, 2 others injured in the village of Krasnoivka. Casualties are also reported across Kherson, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Chernihiv, Mykolaiv, Luhansk, Dnipropetrovsk and Sumy oblasts. President Zelensky used a press conference last night with Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, to urge the US to speed up weapon deliveries, warning that advancing Russian forces are trying to take advantage of the current shortfall in material, as we've been reporting. He said, this is President Zelensky, he said the situation on the battlefield directly depended on the speed of ammunition supplies. He said, "Timely support for our army, as is needed. Today, I don't see anything positive on this point yet. There are supplies. They have slightly begun. This process needs to be sped up. The Russian army is now trying to take advantage of a situation when we are waiting for supplies from our partners, and that is exactly why the speed of deliveries means stabilising the front." In response, NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg, he said serious delays in support have meant serious consequences on the battlefield. Ukraine has been outgunned for months, forced to ration its ammunition, but it's not too late for Ukraine to prevail. Okay, next, David. The Russian-backed head of occupied Crimea has claimed that the Russian air defences there intercepted long-range ATACMS over Crimea last night. Sergei Aksyonov posted a photo on Telegram showing what he described as undetonated submunitions of ATACMS missiles. He said they'd been shot down over the occupied Crimean cities of Zankoy and Simferopol. Mr. Aksionov did not specify when and how many missiles had been shot down, which is the first clue. Local Crimean Telegram accounts also reported the news, or amplified the news, and said the Crimean bridge, the Kerch bridge, had been closed as a result. Now, we can't verify any of that, but I would just ask for a very brief diversion. Let's have a look at ATACMS. Let's have a very quick chat about ATACMS. Broadly, there's a lot more detail, so please forgive me for skimming over some of it, but the big bits you need to know. Broadly, 2 versions. Okay, Block 1, standard surface version of ATACMS. It has submunitions, as in smaller grenades, if you like. Each is a round ball about the size of a tennis ball, weighs about half a kilo, wrapped in a tungsten fragmenting wall, steel casing with incendiary pellets. Now the missile fires in, casing comes off, all these submunitions fly out, saturating an area, killing troops on the ground, destroying unarmoured equipment. They're not much cop against armour itself, but good against troops in the open and unarmoured equipment. This Block 1, a range up to about 100 miles, 160 Ks, and it has about 950 of these submunitions in it. Okay, so that's Block 1. Block 1 Alpha, why don't they call it Block 2? Anyway, Block 1 Alpha has fewer submunitions, so only about 300, but goes a lot further. Goes about 300 kilometres. Okay, so it's got the submunition version. It also has what's called a unitary warhead, i.e. a version where there's just one big blast. So that one doesn't have submunitions, but it can make a very big hole in whatever it lands on. It's said to have a CEP of about 10 to 50 metres. CEP stands for Circular Error Probable. Now, this is how military planners rate the accuracy of something. So it's a circle with a diameter of, in this case, maximum 50 metres. So draw a circle around that target. That's where the thing's going to land. The problem is that with CEP, it accounts for only 50% of the missile. So the other 50 could land an inch outside that circle or a mile, and it would still be classified as a precision weapon. I have a particular beef with the term CEP, but that's something for another day. Let's go back to ATACMS. So there's 2 types, and the second type, the Block 1 Alpha, can also have one great big blast. Of course, the context right now is all about long-range ATACMS with the recent US aid supply or aid bill going through. And Moscow fears these longer-range ATACMS being used inside Russia. Note last Friday's comments from US Defence Secretary and even the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's comments about Ukraine can now take the fight to Russia. So they're worried about these things being used inside Russia, and they're worried about the Kerch bridge. Although, to be perfectly honest, I think a single warhead would not be enough to bring the bridge down. It needs a double charge, something like Taurus. That's the big deal about Taurus. But, hey, all the chat at the moment is ATACMS, and it's the long-range variant. So that's the context we're operating in. So it's in Moscow's interest to downplay the threat from these things, to say that they've brought one down, and maybe they have. Maybe if all they've got to show is submunitions, though, that's all they're showing off. It could be the shorter range version, it could be another system, or the whole thing could be made up, right? We don't know, essentially, but I don't think President Zelensky and General Syrskyi are this morning moaning about having been gifted a load of long-range ATACMS and they're all useless. Okay, so just take any comment coming out of Russia with a massive pinch of salt. We don't know. We simply don't know if these submunitions that they're showing comes from ATACMS, the short range, the long range, another system. They've stored them in a shed for a few months, etc., etc. We just don't know. But they are a very capable weapon system. Okay, a couple more, David. Russia's going to showcase captured Western equipment, including British and American armoured vehicles, alongside other NATO kit in Moscow to coincide with Victory Day on May the 9th in Russia. There's a month-long exhibition featuring 30 different vehicles from 12 countries, including German Leopard 2 tanks, American Bradley IFVs, infantry fighting vehicles, that have been taken from Ukraine. This is coming out of Russia's defence ministry. Footage of the lineup of Western hardware being shared on social media appeared to show a British-donated Mastiff and Husky armoured vehicles, part of the Dogs of War from Afghanistan. There's British and NATO flags all over it. Now, at least this year, there's going to be some tanks to look at, unlike last year for Victory Day parade. That's what I'll say. I don't think they'll actually be on the Victory Day parade. They'll be elsewhere in Moscow. But I think it would have been quite nice to see Leopards, Bradleys and Challengers rolling through Red Square, sizing the place up. Anyway, other vehicles, there's Swedish CV90 IFVs, French AMX-10 tank. Is it a tank? It's not a tank. It's got wheels. It's not a tank. And British Saxon armoured personnel carrier. They've done this before. Similar event was held last year in Moscow. They showed off some Western equipment. Fine. We can't confirm whether the stuff they're showing now was captured recently or a year ago. Now, Ukraine has put on or displayed destroyed Russian equipment in central Kyiv. Its forces normally try to repurpose any captured vehicles, but if they're totally trashed, then they show the population what they are, what they're up against. They don't need to be fearful of these things. The last time we were in Ukraine, I did a short video from St. Michael's Square. You'll be able to find that on YouTube. And just one final one for me, David. About 30 Ukrainian men are said to have died trying to illegally cross Ukraine's borders to avoid fighting in the war. This comes from the spokesman for Ukraine's border service, speaking to Ukrinform news agency. So Andrei Demchenko said some lost their lives while attempting to cross a mountain river or traverse mountains. He said since the start of the war, border guards have uncovered about 450 criminal plots that have attempted to smuggle people across the border. He said attempts to illegally cross the border occur every day. Most of these attempts are outside of border checkpoints. I guess they would be on the border with Moldova and Romania. The largest number with forged documents is recorded on the border with Poland. Roland's been commenting recently about speaking to people who are trying to avoid the draft. He might have a comment on this a bit later. And I'll take a pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of those updates. Francis, let's go to you before our guest. Francis, what have you been looking at in the diplomatic and political space?
Well, thanks, David. Quite an esoteric assortment of stories today, but all significant in their own way. Listeners will recall that various rows are presently brewing in several European countries since Kyiv announced that it was to withdraw consular support abroad to Ukrainian men of military fighting age, as Dom was just talking about. There have been suggestions that some countries may be compelled to forcibly send such men out of the country who may be there to escape the draft, though the Kyiv Independent is reporting today that the Estonian Interior Ministry has said that it has no plans to do so. That follows a similar announcement from Germany. Poland, however, is saying that it will wait for Kyiv to, quote, take the initiative on how to approach the topic. And Lithuania has said it would be in favour of assisting Kyiv whilst in consultations with the EU on the matter. Now, for more context, Ukraine has not publicly appealed to any of its partners to force out or otherwise restrict its male citizens living abroad. But given that Kyiv has suspended new applications for support abroad and banned sending documents and passports to Ukrainian men of 18 to 60 years old who reside outside the country, there are discussions ongoing that the groundwork may be being laid for that to occur. In Estonia, as of April 26th, there were 6,500 Ukrainian men in that age bracket with residence permits under temporary protection. So it's not vast quantities, but one can imagine how it adds up when one includes all of the European countries, especially those surrounding Ukraine. We should expect this debate to increase with intensity over the coming weeks and months, I think. Now, staying in Ukraine, in what may initially come across as a rather obscure story to feature prominently, but bear with me, the Duchess of Edinburgh has become the first member of the British royal family to visit Ukraine since the full-scale invasion. She travelled there on Monday to show her solidarity with the men, women and children affected by war, meeting with President Zelensky and his wife and delivering a message on behalf of the King. The trio discussed how best to support survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and the women peace builders who are working to ensure Ukraine's recovery. Now, the reason I mention this is it's quite a noteworthy symbolic gesture from what many would consider Britain's premier international ambassadors. It's very, very rare for royals to put themselves in harm's way, but they know that doing so will draw attention to specific issues. Now, we've already discussed in recent months how King Charles III showed a very strongly worded message to mark the second anniversary of the conflict. He spoke of the indescribable aggression that faced Ukrainians following the unprovoked attack on their land. Then last March, the Prince of Wales, Prince William, travelled to Poland on a personal mission to praise British troops working near the Ukraine border for defending our freedoms. That was read by many as a signal that the royal family was supportive of a more hawkish stance Poland was taking in response to Russian aggression. Now, the Duchess's visit formed part of her work as champion of the UK's Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative. Evidently, she wants to draw attention on the war crimes angle of this conflict. She said rape is used to demean, to degrade and to destroy. We have to get better at trying to prevent that from happening. Where we cannot prevent it, what we must do is put measures in place to support those who have fallen victim to such crimes. Now, I think given the amount of attention on war crimes that we've talked about on here relative to perhaps what is in the public consciousness, I think it's quite interesting that she's chosen to focus on this issue, and indeed that it's her that's gone to Ukraine as opposed to other members of the royal family. So that's why I mention it here. I think it's quite interesting and revealing of perhaps some of the discussions going on behind closed doors. Now, turning southeast from Ukraine, I know listeners have been quite interested in what's been happening in Georgia recently, where the row continues over the fate of its so-called Russia law, which seeks to control alleged foreign and specifically Western influence in the country, in an initiative many see as being championed by Moscow behind the scenes. Now, for more detail on this, I'll point listeners to a profile in our paper by Cameron Henderson of Benina Ivanishvili, the former Prime Minister and the founder and honorary chairman of the Georgian Dream Party, who set Georgia on course for European integration, now perceived by many to be steering it towards the Kremlin's embrace. As Cameron writes, he returned as a kind of shadow leader late last year, with critics claiming he was behind plans to revive that Putin-style law designed to crush dissent. The piece lays out the various hypotheses as to why he's doing this, with some saying it's merely a cynical ploy to win the election, though others believing it is more sincere. In a recent speech, Ivanishvili addressed supporters in Tbilisi, saying that he believed the important decisions in this world are being taken by the global party of war, a global force that first forced the confrontation of Georgia with Russia and then put Ukraine in even worse peril. NGOs and radical opposition are acting on their behalf. The laws that we are proposing are there to expose those dark lineages. Quite a revealing speech, I think. We'll continue to monitor what happens in Georgia very closely. And just since I mentioned conspiracy theories, listeners will recall the name of Alexander Dugin, or Dugin as it's sometimes pronounced, the so-called Russian intellectual who's believed to be the target of a Ukrainian assassination plot which killed his daughter in 2022. Well, revealingly, he's the latest guest on our old friend Tucker Carlson's online interview series, where he's portrayed as a sort of traditional values conservative who he's neither a military leader or a politician, yet is somebody that Tucker claims is despised by Ukrainians and many in the West. He's portrayed as a sort of martyr for free speech because many booksellers ban his books, though I would posit that it's less an issue of censorship than the fact that Dugin is openly called for genocide in Ukraine, and because the books are not serious scholarly tomes but angry pamphlets calling that, or arguing, should I say, that Russia is engaged in a civilizational struggle that will bring about the dawn of a new Eurasian empire controlled by ethnic Russians. Now, that said, I actually don't believe that they should be banned. If they are, we should be buying and studying them, as there is some evidence that his most famous work, The Foundations of Geopolitics, which he published in 1997, called for Russia to rebuild its power and influence, and was actually quite widely discussed in certain military circles in Russia at the time. Now, I only mention this because it is yet further evidence of the way in which Russia is being held up by some as a bastion of traditionalism amongst figures of the right, a sort of defender of Christendom against the forces of postmodernism. But if you're looking to Dugin for your salvation, I would argue that you're really looking in the wrong place. This is a man that many, many people believe is, if not a Nazi, a fascist. And so it's very, very revealing, I think, that Tucker Carlson has spoken to him as his latest guest after, of course, that long-form interview with Putin a few weeks ago. I'd love to do a more philosophical episode one day, but I'm not sure how Dom would feel about that. And just lastly, more on Russian sanctions, more grim reading on the oil price cap, David, with insurers warning that it has become unenforceable and is pushing ships into a shadow fleet, and yet another sign that Putin's regime is finding ways around the G7 sanctions. The international group of P&I clubs said there has been little success for the price cap on Russian oil, designed, of course, to limit the sales of the crude to less than $60 a barrel. In evidence to members of Parliament in Britain today, the group of 12 marine third-party liability insurers said that most ships now trade in Russian oil operate under the rules of jurisdictions in which the oil price cap does not apply and in countries where it's not observed. They said, and I quote, provided the owners and operators of ships that carry such oil and products do not have a G7 jurisdiction nexus, they are entitled to operate entirely legally in accordance with the rules and laws that apply to them. The oil price cap appears increasingly unenforceable as more ships and services move into this parallel trade. We estimate around 800 tankers have already left the international group clubs as a direct result of the introduction of the oil price cap. So another rather niche story, David, but colouring in the picture that has been formulating for a while on sanctions.
Well, thank you very much, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley, for your reporting. Let's now go to our guest. Nataliya, it's really, really wonderful to see you again. Welcome to the Telegraph. Would you like just to briefly introduce yourself before we get into the story you'll be talking about today?
So I'm Ukrainian journalist Nataliya Gumenyuk. I'm CEO of the Public Interest Journalism Lab and co-founder of the Reckoning Project for the last couple of years. We are focused on documenting alleged war crimes in Ukraine.
Well, Nataliya, let's talk about the Reckoning Project then. So you were in Argentina with a victim of Russian war crimes. Present in Buenos Aires, you submitted a criminal complaint to the Argentine federal judiciary. Can you talk to us about this? What did you submit and why Argentina?
Indeed, it's the first complaint of that kind. This is the criminal complaint to the Argentinian federal judiciary on the case of tortures. We traveled there with a Ukrainian citizen whom, due to security reason, we would anonymize. And he was held by the Russian forces in one of the occupied towns. There are a couple of reasons why Argentina. I've just had a chance just some minutes ago to go on talking to the lawyers of the Reckoning Project who are of different origins, but some of them are based here in London. And we again discussed that. So first of reason, Ukrainian General Prosecutor Office has registered almost 130,000 of alleged violations of the Geneva Conventions. So Ukraine really needs to share the burden. It's not like they do not want to investigate, but it's really too much. And Argentina, first of all, it has these provisions in its constitutions. They use the principle of the universal jurisdiction. So if a serious crime of that kind has been committed wherever globally, they can prosecute. Then, secondly, this country in particular has a very strong history of this type of investigations and legislation because of the history of junta, history of the successful history of the trials, and it's really they have this practice. A number of different countries were using the Argentinian, universal jurisdiction. But for us, it was also very important to submit that in one of the countries outside of Europe, just to show that this crime has no borders, especially Russian propaganda. And I've spent some recent weeks, speaking about the cause and researching more and more in Latin America. They are very successful to push the narrative that, this is just the Western war, the West is successful, the West is biased. But the work in Argentina, where we also have found a lot of support and a lot of understanding, because prior to that we met with survivors, our team and the team of the lawyers had met, different representatives of the legal world from Argentina. We all heard, yes, we agree, this is the crime which has no border. And here we also feel that torture shouldn't be used anywhere. So there is this multiple reasons. And in the end, what is most important for me, that when our survivor traveled there and I was accompanying him, he himself said after meeting a lot of people there that, their experience gives him, some inspiration, that he understands this fight can be long, but it's worth it not to give up.
Well, thank you so much for that overview, Nataliya. Can you tell us a little bit more? I was fascinated by what you said there about about the impact of Russian propaganda in South America. What was the reaction in Argentina amongst the people you met, amongst the lawyers in the courthouse when you brought this criminal complaint? Can you take us inside the room? How did people react?
Sure. But, for us, it was extremely important not to parachute there. Also, as a Ukrainians, and also in our team, there is a Bulgarian lawyer, Svetlana von Banem. There is a Syrian, British barrister, Ibrahim Olabi. So we came from different backgrounds. So prior to that, I met multiple people. We traveled. We showed the documentaries, which we produced with the Reckoning Project on the crimes committed. I met, we made an interview with this, even like the judge who presided in the famous trial against juntas in 1985. So we really were looking like how the people would see that. And when we discussed that, people from various multiple views, and we have also very interesting political moment when you have the president who has difficult relations with, let's say, human rights world and law enforcement world. Still, the Argentinians are very proud of their history, and even when we had an engagement of one of the survivors who lived through the tortures, and we are doing the documentary about that, and he talked to our witness, he said, I don't care, I do not know much about Putin and Zelensky, but what you lived through shouldn't happen. So, for us, it's also very important to say that these human rights are universal. And of course, we coming from the different backgrounds. And when you talk to a lot of people, in fact, the war against Ukraine isn't something controversial in Argentina. Largely the population understands. But it was rather positive feedback. And I feel like Argentinians are really proud by the fact that, they have this legislation, that they take human rights seriously, in particular this particular crime of torture. So again, we were very cautious, but I think that in the end, it's going on. We talking, we publishing articles. People are becoming more interested, and not just in Argentina, but I had a chance to interact with other people in various other countries where actually the Russian propaganda is way stronger than in Argentina.
Could you tell us a little bit about what happens next? So you've submitted this criminal complaint. There's been lots of attention. People have been listening and following the story. How does this now work through the legal system? And what are the chances of justice for Mr. M?
So there should be, it's a judge who decides whether to open the investigations, but there is always an opportunity to appeal. As well, there is an opportunity to push forward with the participation of the prosecutor. So Argentina has a number of the steps we can, go. For us, as the legal team says, and I will be quoting them, I'm very, responsible journalist working with the lawyers. I follow what they say. That at this stage we are focusing on the opening the case, but of course, in universal jurisdiction cases. It's often that they take years and months, in this regard, for us would be interesting whether there would be and whether there is a possibility of the cooperation with Ukrainian law enforcement, because it's very usually this type of universal jurisdictions often is used when the other government, let's say, it's such a kind of a dictatorship, it won't cooperate. In our case, it's pretty unique. Maybe there could be a cooperation, and we would welcome that. There are a lot of evidence in various international institutions. So, for instance, we would look for the arrest warrant. And I think it's a lot, because also something to understand, and that's something I understood later. Argentina, for instance, doesn't have the visa regime for Russian. So Russian citizens, they can easily travel, and I'm speaking about all type of Russian citizens, but there they don't ask what are your political views, and to Uruguay, to Argentina, to a number of the Latin American countries. So I think for us it's also very important to show these perpetrators that no, maybe today you won't go to Biarritz and Monaco or Mallorca, but today they can go to Dubai, to Bangkok, but maybe at least they would be cautious about that part of the world. And when I later talked to some of the also representative of the Argentinian, society, former diplomats, they also said that, we know that our countries cannot do much to Ukraine. We won't give weapons most probably. We probably don't have finance to support. But we can, maybe help with that. It's in fact an interesting example what, the countries which cannot provide physical support in terms of money and ammunition can do.
And did you have any reaction at all from Russia, or any statement or reaction from officials, or has it been pretty silent from their end?
No, they're pretty silent on their end. Also, while we were working on the story, we broke the news via the Reuters agency. They approached Moscow, their Argentinian bureau, and there was no reply. But I'm happy with that. At this stage, it would last long. We better work, but of course we want that it matters.
Well, thank you so much, Nataliya. I'll hand over to Francis, who I know also has a question. Francis Dearnley.
Thanks so much for your time today. Just zooming out from this specific case, how would you assess the state of war crimes prosecutions, lawfare, for want of a better term, in the Ukraine context at the moment? There are no big public trials happening. Can we expect anything of that nature before the war ends, do you think? I suppose what I'm really getting at here is I still feel that the issue of war crimes is not something that is in the public consciousness as much. And I'm wondering whether it might be something we can expect to happen with trials in the coming months and years.
It's not really the case that there are no big trials. First of all, in Ukraine inside, there are hundreds of trials. We just recently had the case when our own journalist of the Reckoning Project, he has been abducted at early stage of the war in his native town of Kakhovka. And there was a court decision. It was against the collaborators, the Ukrainian nationals who were, helping to abduct them. The Russians who hold them, they are in absentia. They are not still fully identified. Some of them are identified, but there was a court decision. So it's something we follow closely. There was a very famous case of the whole village being kept in the basement in the Yahidne, and there was a court decision. So there were some, in that regard, some of the Russian soldiers who were identified. Yes, they are in absentia, but the court was there, and it's a very famous case. I also think that the ISIS two cases opened by ICC on the deportation of the children in March 2023. And the ones on the infrastructure, attacks against infrastructure, they are very important because they are against the head of the Black Fleet. And also, I'm always, it's a very long position of the Russian general, commander of the long-range aviation and airspace force, Sergei Kobylyash as well. Quite high-profile person in Russia. And I would remember that we had a chance with David to be at our presentation here in the Frontline Club in London, and particularly discussing that there are no, investigations in particular in the incidents of the missile strikes, because it's very difficult to prove, and that would be so important to open that, and it happened. So I don't think it's that bad, but for us it's still very, very important to say that, yes, we should stop to think about this as a tragedies, these are the crimes, and it gives us a bit of the, motivation not to be so disempowered.
That's really, really interesting. I just had one follow-up on that, which is, I guess what I was getting at is the degree to, do you think we can expect anything that's a really huge trial before the war ends that's more in the style of a kind of Nuremberg? And I know that's an extreme example, but the reason I use it is, of course, we still talk about it now. It had such huge resonance and such importance, and I'm wondering whether you think we can ever expect that.
I don't think we shouldn't underestimate what is going on. The first arrest warrant was against the existing head of state, against Vladimir Putin. What else do we want? Of course, we want to have Ukraine, argues for the special tribunal, but I think it's big enough. But something also to understand. Yes, Ukrainians, and I talk to a lot of survivors and myself, we all understand that not all the crimes would be investigated. There won't be all people persecuted. In fact, Ukrainians already had made this compromise that we know that there won't be revenge, there won't be punishment, but there is only one civilized ways to, put your anger and revenge to something, and it's justice. It would be partial, but we already agreed to that. So I think we should be very serious. Let's at least do that.
Thanks, Nataliya. Can I just ask a question? How was the team and your work received in Argentina? With the history of the junta and the issues there, and in particular with Britain? I mean, it's not in modern consciousness, I'm guessing, but the issue about Falklands is still there, Malvinas, I think. But I just wonder if there was any sort of lingering. Is this seen as a Western fight against Russia? But yeah, more broadly, how your team was
I should say that I was there as a Ukrainian. We had a Bulgarian lawyer, Syrian lawyer. So it's not purely Western, to be honest. And again, I was when I coming. We went, for instance, to the famous detention place where the Argentinian Navy was based and tortured people. We talk with the people over there and we learn from them. For instance, first of all, even when I was there with a survivor, we understand, there is something in this shared pain. When I go to the basement in that museum, when he goes in the basement, which was a real cellar, we understand it means something for us. We also were asking for some, advice how to deal with that, how to prosecute, how to build the cases. For instance, Argentina has an incredible history of the investigations on the deportation of the children. And they have such institution as Bank of Genetics, where till now there are people coming and checking their DNA in case they were separated because the children were given to sometimes perpetrators. And it's happening now. And when I was there in that institution, we had a discussion that what Argentina has, for instance, they experience, a lot of countries can establish DNA today, but they can have a very interesting, unique experience on establishing the children when there are no parents. They need to have, which is not very common, but this experience is handy to Ukraine. So I think that's our way to find these commonalities, to find this, shared pain in very peculiar issues, and then people relate. And that's why, and what I'll be honest found that I earlier mentioned, they have controversies in Latin America because somehow they try to work with universal jurisdiction in such instances as Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba. And for Latin America, that's complicated because they have, refugees, they have people from various camps politically. Interesting enough, they might not clearly be fully engaged into the war against Ukraine because it's distant, but there is no doubt that the Russia is perpetrator, and the whole idea of attack on the sovereignty is taken very, very seriously by Latin America. The idea of attack on sovereignty is something everybody can relate.
Natalia, thank you so much for your time. Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you think is important for our listeners to hear?
I think that for us, it's important to keep the story going, not to underestimate and undermine this effort, because for a survivor, it's a huge effort. And, for me to think about one person being, devoted, finding some cause, it's already enough. I understand that behind the big figures, we sometimes see we don't have Vladimir Putin, in the orange robe. But for one person to move forward, it's already something, and we need to appreciate. And I should say, we have privilege to talk about that. Not everybody can have strengths, and unless we have it, we should go on.
Thank you so much, Dom, Francis, and Natalia. Coming up, we hear from our senior foreign correspondent, Roland Oliphant, who's been speaking to Ukrainian men living abroad, who Kyiv wants to persuade to return to fight for their country.
Yes. So the context for the article that I've recently published is basically I've been talking to a few of those men abroad, and also a couple of army contacts about what they think about it. So it's not kind of big picture political reporting, but it's about getting a taste of sentiment amongst ordinary people. And the context is, of course, this. Last week, April 23rd, the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry said we are going to suspend consular services for men between the ages of 18 and 60 abroad. If you want to apply to renew your passport or your, I don't know, what other document might you need, your marriage certificate, something like that, they said, if it's not done by April 23rd, we're not going to give it to you. And this is all linked to the new mobilization law. Now, officially, this is a temporary suspension, but the basic message is Ukraine is trying to get a lot of the men who went abroad to come back to fight, and it's all linked to this manpower shortage. As we say again and again, Ukraine is known to have three big weaknesses on the battlefield at the moment. One is ammunition and equipment, especially Western supplies. One is a lack of properly prepared defenses, and the other one is manpower. So essentially, there's pressure being brought to bear on many of the men abroad to come back. Now, context, always important. So men between the ages of 18 and 60 as fighting age, they've been banned from leaving Ukraine since martial law was declared on the 24th of February 2022, the first day of the invasion. But there's always been a lot of ways around that, right? So you can, if you can obtain a finding that you are medically unfit for service, you could leave. There was an exemption for fathers of more than 3 children. There were official exemptions you could get for work and things like that. So people have been able to get around it, and other people have left illegally. Some people, have been caught kind of swimming a river between Ukraine and Hungary and stuff like that. How many are abroad, I don't know. But there was this announcement last week to try and pressure men to come back. It is temporary. So this is linked to a new mobilization law that was passed earlier this month. That mobilization law is going to link consular services. If you want to apply for your passport, you can, but you've got to update your details with the military authorities so they know where to find you if they want to find you. So this ban is a temporary suspension officially until that law comes into force on the 18th of May. And there's meant to be a website where men abroad will be able to do that, but it's not up and running yet. Whatever the details are, there's been a bit of a backlash. So a lot of people openly resentful, feel like they're being pressured to go back and fight, and frankly a sense that this has been a bit cack-handed on the part of the government. And if you like, I can give you a couple of examples of the guys I spoke to, if you like.
Yeah, please. So who did you speak to exactly, and was it difficult persuading them to talk? What was that like?
No, it wasn't that difficult, actually. It was only in kind of ordinary news terms. I had to find people very quickly to meet a deadline. So we scrambled a little bit, but it actually wasn't that difficult to get people to talk and to get people to speak quite frankly, really. So I spoke to, in quite rapid succession, during quite a tight reporting day, 3 blokes. One called Vladimir and one called Volodymyr, which is the Ukrainian version of Vladimir. They are different people. So the one who uses the Russian version, Vladimir, he had sent his ex-wife and their 4-year-old son abroad to Germany at the beginning of the war. He'd stayed in Ukraine. He'd been working for 2 years. And then earlier this year, he just had enough. And he'd been to the commission. He'd been medically examined and declared unfit for service. So he was allowed to leave. And he said, it was actually a morally difficult decision for me. I just finally decided that a child needs a father. And at the end of the day, it's not negotiable, right? My family needs me. That's just not negotiable. I have to go. And it doesn't, it doesn't really feel fair to start pushing people to come back like that. But he's one of the guys who has left kind of since the war began. There's a whole other group of people who've been living in Europe abroad. Ukrainians who've been living abroad for many, many years, people who didn't flee the war. And there's this other guy who's been living for a long time in the Czech Republic. And he said all his Ukrainian friends in that kind of community of migrant workers in the Czech Republic, in Poland, all his mates back in Kyiv, he says, all my friends think the law is not fair. No one's happy with it. The government's forcing us. And frankly, this is just going to make us more likely to take citizenship in other countries. He came back to this twice, actually, in a conversation. You should understand people won't return. He said, the longer this war goes on, the more laws like this are passed, the more people hate Ukraine and the government. And then he said something I think that was quite telling. He said, why should I return to fight for what? Why didn't the government care about labor migrants like me before the war? So that's a guy who said he felt absolutely no obligation to come back and fight. Third guy refused to go on the record, didn't want to be quoted, but was happy to say that I'd spoken to him. He did leave the country illegally since the war began. I'm not quite sure how he did it. He's now living in Indonesia and has absolutely no plans to go back, and he said, look, I'm just an observer. I don't see why I should get involved in this. All 3 of those people insisted they felt no moral obligation from their friends or their family to go back. Because I kept putting that question to them, don't you feel you're, letting down your country and so on. None of them admitted to feeling that kind of pressure, which I thought was quite telling, really, and quite interesting.
What about the reaction of the military people you were speaking to? Is that right? So you're speaking to some people in the military as well. What was their reaction to knowing that this was the attitude of some Ukrainians living abroad, that they had no intention, as you said, of returning home to fight?
Yeah, so I mean that's obviously not a good sign. And again, it wasn't a scientific survey, right? It was just guys we managed to speak to quite quickly for some reaction who would be affected by this decision. But in that small sample, the sentiment was quite clearly quite upset and it didn't really look like they were going to feel like they were compelled to come back and fight, which doesn't look good. Anyway, it just so happened that a week or so before that, I'd been speaking to a contact of mine in Kharkiv who signed up on the first day of the war and is now actually working in recruitment. And we'd been talking about this, about, the difficulties of finding people. So I rang him back, Nikita Rozhenko. He's a counsellor from Kharkiv who we've talked about a few times on the podcast over the course of the war. Anyway, he is now a recruiting sergeant working for a territorial defence battalion based in Kharkiv. And he said, look, the recruiting situation is really bad. Right? The people I want are like 27 to 30 years old and fit. The people I get are almost always, they're 45 to 50. They are usually got chronic health problems. They're from the kind of the economic and social margins of society. Whoever they are, like a medical commission will pass them as fit for service, but when they get to their units, they will be found to be unfit. And nonetheless, he said to me, they'll be found to be unfit. Their commanders will realise that they're being sent people who are not really up to the demands of, modern war fighting. And he said, look, I told him what these guys had said to me. He said, the first thing he said was, and I completely agree with them. I said, well, come again. What do you mean? He said, well, look, we shouldn't be pressuring people to come back to Ukraine. We should be welcoming them with open arms. And then he said, look, the problem with this law, it's a compromise. It's a law by committee. It doesn't please anybody. And the mobilization law he's talking about, which has led to this measure, it's too harsh for civilians. It's going to make people's lives difficult, but it's not actually going to persuade anyone to join the military. And nobody's actually addressed what the recruiting sergeants are saying, like what we want. And he said what they want is for the brigade to be able to recruit directly for themselves. That the brigades want to be able to go out, send their own recruiters out, recruit for themselves, not to have to send them to a local recruiting office, which then could send them to any part of the army. And his argument was that the good brigades that people know are good, that people want to serve in because they treat their men well and they're well equipped and they're competently led, they will become stronger, they will grow larger, the bad ones will wither away, and ultimately you'll get a better army. And he was really, really keen. When I told him I was writing about this, he was really keen that, that message got out there. And his bottom line, which I think was also very interesting, was he said, look, it's not there that aren't people who want to serve. There's lots of people who want to serve, actually. The problem is they don't want to be sent to a meat battalion. And the term meat battalion is soldier slang. It will come up if you have honest conversations with Ukrainian kind of privates and NCOs, that phrase will come up a lot. And it's soldier slang for a unit which they perceive is where the officers don't care about the men and where people just go and get killed because there is no real effort to lead them competently or to take care of guys. He felt it would be inappropriate for him to start naming units. But I've had conversations with soldiers where they have named units, and I should pass that on. I was in confidence. But like all the squaddies kind of have these conversations, and they, that brigade, oh, you don't want to go over there, it's a meat brigade. Oh, but you want to go over to that one, that's good. And people kind of it's no secret that people try and transfer between units within the Ukrainian armed forces when they feel they're in a bad unit to what they think is a better unit. But anyway, that's the gist of the conversations I had. How it pans out, I mean, we know that there is no one's disputing that there's a manpower problem. I don't think anyone's disputing that there's a problem with confidence amongst Ukrainian men about whether they want to risk signing up at the moment. But it's a problem that definitely has to be addressed if Ukraine is to, stay in the war for, we're talking about 2, 3, 4, who knows how many years now.
Well, thank you very much, Roland, for joining us. We'll come back to you at the end for your final thought. Francis, would you like to start?
I've just embarked on properly reading Winston Churchill's History of the Second World War, which I've read bits of in the past, but never in its entirety. His views are, of course, very well known about the errors made in the 1930s that led to the outbreak of the Second World War. But of course, those rules can be applicable to smaller ones too. And I was rereading the earlier chapters of the text, and it's just quite striking how many parallels one can apply to our present context, I think. So I just wanted to give a flavour from a few extracts. Indeed, when you open up the very first volume, which is there are 6 volumes, the first is called The Gathering Storm, and it says, theme of the volume, quote, how the English-speaking peoples, through their unwisdom, carelessness and good nature, allowed the wicked to rearm. And then he goes on and opens and says, one day, President Roosevelt told me that he was asking publicly for suggestions about what the war should be called. I said at once, the unnecessary war. There never was a war more easy to stop than that which has just wrecked what was left of the world from the previous struggle. It is my earnest hope that pondering upon the past may give guidance in days to come, enable a new generation to repair some of the errors of former years, and thus govern, in accordance with the needs and glory of man, the awful unfolding scene of the future. Then later on, he says, after the end of the World War of 1914, there was a deep conviction and almost universal hope that peace would reign in the world. Sounded reminiscent to me of 1989. This heart's desire of all the peoples could easily have been gained by steadfastness in righteous convictions and by reasonable common sense and prudence. The victorious powers and allies were at that time all powerful, so far as their outside enemies were concerned. And just lastly, one more extract. I've always been ready to use force in order to defy tyranny or ward off ruin. But had our British-American allied affairs been conducted with the ordinary consistency and common sense usual in decent households, there was no need for force to march unaccompanied by law, and strength, moreover, could have been used in righteous causes with little risk of bloodshed. In their loss of purpose, in their abandonment even of the themes they most sincerely espoused, Britain, France, and most of all, because of their immense power and impartiality, the United States allowed conditions to be gradually built up, which led to the very climax they dreaded most. They have only to repeat the same well-meaning, short-sighted behaviour towards the new problems which in singular resemblance confront us today to bring about a third conclusion and convulsion from which none may live to tell the tale. I'll leave it there, David.
Thank you, Dom and Francis. Roland, can I come to you next, please?
Thank you. A little bit difficult to follow, but here's my thought. I've been having a few conversations over the past couple of days, just trying to get into what we think is going to happen over the summer. Like, there's a lot of talk about, if you read almost any analysis, the anticipated Russian offensive that is meant to begin in summer or not. As far as I can make out, no one is actually sure whether there is another one coming or what's happening is on the ground now is the big offensive. But here's the mechanics of that offensive. I was having a very interesting conversation this morning about how Russia has made gains. And the message I was getting was, look, the frustrating thing here is that this is a really easily fixable problem, and it comes down to ammunition. It goes like this. No man's land is about 1 kilometer wide. The Russians bring up some men supported by, maybe 20 guys supported by half a dozen armored vehicles in the middle of the night. They identify a spot on the line which is relatively thinly defended. And remember, guys, we talk about the First World War a lot, right, to describe the trench systems along the 1,500-kilometer front line in Ukraine. But that is slightly misleading because those trenches are not packed full of people as you would expect in the First World War. Everyone's stretched thin on both sides. So the Russians put up a drone, they find what looks like a weak spot, and they press forward. And the guy I was speaking to said, look, 80% of the time, our drones spot that, and we bring our artillery to bear, and we stop it. But then if they attack it somewhere else, we probably run out of ammunition for that day. And so then they make a breakthrough. And again, he said, we're talking about 20 guys, maybe backed by half a dozen armored vehicles. And then we have to retreat, because we simply don't have the ammunition. This is a small problem which really should never have existed in the first place, is really easy to fix as long as that Western ammunition finally makes it to the front. And that speaks to, two issues. The first is just, if the Russians can make those advances, no matter how small they are, no matter that they're not massive breakthroughs, but if they can make those advances with such relatively small tactical groups of people, and the Ukrainians can't resist, that tells you how dire the situation is with ammunition. And the other thing it tells you is about how our own governments, frankly, in the West, the United States, Britain, everyone, for all their rhetoric, have utterly failed, I'm afraid, to act with any sense of appropriate urgency. Yes, we know that the ammunition is coming through finally. Yes, we know that Congress finally, 6 months late, passed an aid bill. If people want to live up to that rhetoric, ring up, I dare you, anyone, ring up a British senior politician today and ask them what their policy is on Ukraine. They'll say, we're going to stand by Ukraine until they win. Those words are empty until they start spending money seriously and they start making plans to spend for the future for an attritional war which could last 4 years. And that is a drum I know that I've banged many, many times. But that's the reality, and that is what's going on in East Ukraine right now, and that is what is going to go on for the next few months until those Western supplies arrive and really make a difference. And if they don't arrive, frankly, it would be game over.
Thank you, Roland. Nataliya, as our guest, would you like the very final words?
So following the discussion, I think it's important to understand that on the enrollment and the draft, you don't need thousands of soldiers if they don't have ammunition. It just doesn't make sense, this type of draft. But as well, we all want fairness, and the Ukrainians want fairness in their laws, in the way how it's organized. But unfortunately, the war isn't neither fair nor smart. So yes, people want smart recruitment, but generals would say we need foot soldiers, and there is no decision to say who is better educated, who is richer. It should be fair. At the same time, I also don't want to have the impression then, like people are not going. I live in Ukraine, and, some things are not just, and sometimes incentives just don't work in democracies as well. If we just are asked, we would like to, donate your taxes instead of the law. Would people do that? No. So sometimes at some point you need to have not just incentives but the laws. But I can say that, for instance, give you a personal example. Within a couple of weeks, my social media manager has been enrolled into the army. The girl who needs to substitute him husband has enrolled to the army. A close family member who, with his will decided to join. And my university mate, a very good friend of mine, I found out that he's now serving, being his early 40s. And this is just a couple of examples of my circle within the last 2 weeks. So people are going to fight. It shouldn't be just a perception that they are not. That would be my final thought. But because I started to speak, more about justice, I still want to end with that. Being here in London, I just remember that General Pinochet, who lived here, he was arrested, he was indicted, he died without being judged, without the conviction. However, still in our memory, he died as a convicted war criminal, not just a general who used to run Chile. So I think we also need to think broad, and it's not symbolic, and do not really give up. And Roland said it's game over. No, it won't. We would stay. We are very hopeful. Again, we are not optimistic. Things are not working so well as we wanted, but I should say Ukrainians are not optimistic, but we are hopeful, and that's different things. We have to hope for the best. Otherwise, how we can pursue?
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.